Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, excuse the voice, got a little congestion going on, but I thought it would be cool today to take a look at a pair of original FG42s and discuss their development and the changes that took place between the first pattern and the second pattern of the FG42. It's fascinating that so much changed here. There's literally not a single part compatible between these two versions of what is essentially the same gun. Now, just for a little quick recap, the design intent of the FG42, the Fallschirmjägergewehr 42, was to give German paratroops, part of the Luftwaffe, a single weapon that could serve as both service rifle and light machine gun. And it needed to be compact and handy enough for them to actually drop with. Prior to this, German paratroops dropped their weapons in separate canisters, which they had to retrieve upon landing before they could use them. That didn't always go well. Now, they requested a weapon of this configuration. And by the way, it's interesting, the closest analog to this in United States military service would have been the Johnson automatic rifle or light machine gun, which we've talked about separately. We'll touch on it a little bit more later on today. But to begin with, designer is a guy named Louis Stange. The design is done by the Rheinmetall company, and the initial development is done in December of 1942, or by December of 1942. Now, this is typically called a first pattern, and this is a second pattern. The most distinctive difference between them, their differences are the grips. The first pattern has a very sharply angled grip. The second pattern has a nearly vertical grip, and the bipods. First pattern has a bipod in the middle. Second pattern has a bipod at the front end. However, in collector terminology and the writing that's been done on these, they've actually been subdivided further into letter designations. So the very early developmental concept guns are termed, and this is just a modern historian collector terminology. It wasn't actually used by the Germans, but the first developmental guns were the Type A and Type B. Type C was the gun that was ready in December of 42. It was shown to Hitler. Hitler got super excited by it. He thought this is great and made a comment to the effect of, after the war, we'll make this the standard infantry rifle for the entire Wehrmacht, not just the Air Force, but the whole army. I actually have a video on one of the Type C rifles that I'll link to at the end of this. It's interesting how it differs from what is the Type E that was eventually put into production. So at the end of 42, Type C looks good, like we've got the concept down, and they build a couple dozen of them to put through more significant trials, and that is the Type D. Those trials ran from February through April of 1943, and they were pretty significant. They involved putting basically 100,000 rounds through a total of 6 different guns. They found a bunch of parts breakages, all the sort of typical stuff that when you have a new gun and you put it through a serious batch of endurance trials, you're going to discover what needs to be tweaked and fixed. So they have a bunch of small parts that are breaking that they modify and improve. And that leaves us with the Type E. That's this guy. That's the first pattern gun, and it goes into actual production in September of 1943. Now, the first use of the gun in combat is actually in May of 1943, before this has gone into production. So that was just a couple of guns on the island of Rhodes, and they were almost certainly Type D trials guns that were then forwarded and actually put into field trials. But September of 43, these guns go into production. Rheinmetall designed it. The Krieghoff company actually built them, primarily because Krieghoff management had a very close relationship with Hermann Goering himself, and they tended to build the guns for the Luftwaffe. They got the contracts. Nothing like a little bit of corrupt nepotism to make your military-industrial complex work better. The contract is for 5,000 guns, but only 2,000 of these would actually be produced, approximately 2,000. And the reason is they're really expensive, really difficult guns to make. To make this rifle work, Louis Stange really is a brilliant designer. And in order to keep the weight below that of a Kar 98K, he had to make a lot of concessions, and some of that involved using relatively exotic steel alloys, what were at the time very cutting-edge alloys that were particularly strong for their weight, and that allows him to reduce the amount of material used. And you're talking about alloys with nickel and manganese, and these alloys become very difficult for Germany to acquire as the war continues. They don't have good sources of them within Germany, they have trouble importing them from other countries, for obvious reasons. And that, combined with some of just the general industrial production issues that Germany had, led to this contract never actually being finished. It's interesting that even as the Type D guns were going through service trials, they were already starting to experiment with a concept for a stamped receiver FG42. Because what the stamped receiver allows them to do is dramatically reduce the amount of billet steel required to make the gun. Instead of having a full milled receiver like this guy does, you can have a front trunnion essentially that does all the work. That's the hard part, where the barrel's attached, where the bolt locks in. But then you wrap that in a stamped sheet metal body, and the metal required for sheet stamping is much easier and cheaper to acquire than the really heavy-duty stuff that a milled receiver requires. So they're already working on this even before these guns go into production. Now, there would be a bit of a hiatus. Type 1s, about 2,000 of them are produced, and they start to see combat. They are never actually used in a parachute drop. The Luftwaffe doesn't do any after they've actually received these rifles, which is interesting. That's kind of, it's not the only time. The US Paramarines adopted rifles and machine guns specifically for parachute operations and then never actually dropped into combat. I should say there were some small operations. Otto Skorzeny, sort of the famous commando of German military service, he and his paratroopers used first pattern FG42s in their glider-borne landings to rescue Mussolini from captivity in September of '43. That's probably the first combat use of the actual first pattern Type E by the Germans. These rifles would go on to be used in basically all the places that the Fallschirmjäger divisions were deployed. So they would see some use in Russia, a bunch of use in Italy, northern France after the D-Day landings, all the way through to the Battle of Berlin at the very end of the war. Now, while they're using these, the stamped gun is going through development. The first stamped gun is deemed the Type F. So this is E, we have a Type F, and they made about 220 of those. They were test guns. They were basically identical to this in configuration. Their testing begins in April of '44. Once again, they find a few issues, make a few tweaks, and finalize on the Type G, which is this, the final version of the gun. Interestingly, there's almost no parts compatibility between the F and the G, the trials version of this and the final production version. They tweak everything around again, including even the magazines. Like the magazines between these guns, all three versions, the E, the trials F, and the G, even the magazines are not interchangeable between those guns. The Luftwaffe contracts with Krieghoff to make 120,000 Type G FG42s. This is there's a pattern with German late war arms production that they make these absolutely insanely impossible orders and plans and predictions, and the FG42 is no exception. 120,000 of them, and also 12,000 scopes. So 1 in 10 of these guns would be equipped with a scope for snipers. About 6,000 are actually produced. Serial numbers go up to high, like 58 or 5900s. And it's interesting how late in the war these were actually completed. Final production doesn't appear to have actually begun until March or April of 1945, which is literally weeks before the end of the war. This is similar to, say, the BAR in US service in World War I, where they're making parts, they're getting things ready to assemble guns, but the guns don't actually see combat service until like 6 weeks before the end of the war. Same thing with the FG42s. These were used in combat, but it was basically Germany and Berlin. It was the very, very end of the war. It appears that they used a bunch of subcontractors, and a lot of the parts were manufactured in large quantity, but they weren't able to get everything finished until that very late date. And so it's only then that Krieghoff can actually start assembling the guns into complete units and shipping them out to troops at the front. So that's how they managed to do a relatively large number, like a couple thousand of these guns within a period of just a few weeks. It's because most of the parts were already manufactured by that point. So that's the overall development cycle, development overview of the FG42. Now let's take a look at these two patterns compared to each other, and I can show you what changed between them. Let's start by taking a look at some of the external features that changed, and we can begin at the very front here. First pattern had this flat surfaced muzzle brake. Second pattern has one with these cool ribs to it. Literally every single part of these guns changed. So even things like how the muzzle brake is held in place. On the second pattern, it's a spring latch like that allows us to unscrew this. On the first pattern, it is actually a plunger that you have to push in that then allows this to come off. In both cases, we have a two-part muzzle adapter. So on this one, this guy's nice and tight on, so I won't take it off. But those change. The bayonets actually change. This was originally a bayonet copied from the French MAS 36 bayonet. In fact, the Type C that I filmed used a modified MAS 36 bayonet. But you can see that the length here has changed. The center support on the bayonet handle, I guess that's the closest thing it's got to a handle, has changed. The length of the bayonet has changed. This is our second pattern. This is our first pattern. The front sight changes substantially. So on the first pattern, it is an unprotected big barleycorn sight, much like a Mauser K98K. On the second pattern, you have a nice small little round post there surrounded by an encircling front sight shield. The bipods change, of course. On the first pattern, the bipod is attached back here at the midpoint of the barrel. And when they developed this, they experimented with both mounting points, and they determined that this was better. There are pros and cons to each. Essentially, having the bayonet mounted at the midpoint of the rifle allows you to traverse a much wider area without having to physically pick up and move the gun. But having it mounted at the front is a little more stable. So it's just a balance of which is more important to you. On the first pattern, they wanted the traverse. By the time they got to the second pattern, they decided that no, actually, the stability of fire with the bipod is more important to us. So that changed. And you can see things like the contours of the bayonet or the bipod leg locking positions right here change. These look at first glance like, oh, it's the same bipod leg, but no, they're actually not. They're totally different stampings. The gas regulators change. So again, the mechanical function is pretty much the same. Note that there's a sling swivel here under the gas block of the first pattern and a non-adjustable gas regulator. When we get to the second pattern, the sling swivel has moved up to the front. Now it's underneath the bayonet lug, and we now have an adjustable 4-position gas regulator. It's still down here in the same basic place, but they've added adjustability to it. The handguard changes a bit. Notice that the center block here is a little bit narrower than on the first pattern. The overall length of the second pattern handguard is about 1/2 inch longer. Gives you a little bit more space to protect your hand. The charging handles have changed. So the first pattern is a cylindrical, second pattern is a longer hooked charging handle. The first pattern guns have a stripper clip guide. You can load this by stripper clip. The second pattern do not, and instead they have a brass deflector here, presumably to make this a little more feasible to shoot left-handed. You can shoot these guns left-handed. They're sort of a quasi-bullpup in that the magazine is mounted directly over the grip, not behind it. But you can shoot this left-handed, but sometimes brass comes back into your face. That brass deflector on the second pattern solves the issue. The grips obviously changed. If you look out on the internet, you'll see a lot of people suggesting that this very sharply angled first pattern grip was done so that troops could shoot from their parachutes while they were descending. I'm pretty sure that's nonsense. German parachutes don't really allow for that. German paratroop doctrine was to drop at very low altitude. The idea, you just wouldn't have much opportunity to do that, and the sharply angled grip actually doesn't even help. This grip is better, more comfortable if you're trying to shoot at a steep downward angle. I think this grip was originally done to mimic the handling of a Kar98K Mauser. The design specification for the FG42 was heavily based on essentially being a select fire weapon that handled like a 98K. So I think that's why the original grip was there. It's very uncomfortable, especially for people with big hands, or if you're wearing bulky gloves, this can be very clumsy to use. The second pattern replaced it with an almost Smith & Wesson revolver-like grip that's nearly vertical and is much more comfortable. We can also see that the retaining springs for holding the fire control group on changed. So again, it's the same basic idea. It's this flat spring. We'll take it off in a moment, but the configuration changes between the two guns. Looking at the magazine wells, we have just an open magazine well on the first pattern. And then the second pattern actually has a pair of spring-loaded magazine protector doors like that. So you can, if you don't have a magazine in the gun, you can close it up to keep dirt from getting in. And pushing in the mag catch allows them to pop open. Also, the first pattern guns had a 3-position selector, safe, semi, and full auto. On the second pattern, they changed up the configuration completely. You now have separated controls, so this, we pull out on that and rotate it around. This controls semi or full auto, and this switch right here controls safe and fire. And the gun's not cocked, so it won't switch, but they go from one control to split controls for that. And then, of course, one of the other really distinctive differences is change in buttstock. So the Type E had a stamped sheet metal buttstock. Early on, these were actually aluminum, and early on, some of them were actually smooth. They added these ribs to give them some more strength and rigidity. The Type G, the second pattern gun, they switched to a wooden buttstock to reduce cost. This is a lot easier to make than the stamping dies to produce that. We can also take a quick look at the magazines. This is a first pattern magazine. You can recognize them by this strap across the front lug is. This is the second pattern magazine. The second pattern is heavier, it's more sturdily made. They did make both 10 and 20 round mags for the FG42. The idea of the 10 is that's what you would drop with because it's more compact. The vast majority of magazines made were the 20 rounders like these. So the locking method is basically the same. It's a nose in, front lug, rock in, latch attaches back here. But like I said, totally different design. You've got these insertion stops so you don't over insert the magazine. On the first pattern gun, that's what this front lip is doing. All right, let's go ahead and take them apart now. So disassembly begins by taking off the buttstock. We have a button here, which allows us to just slide this off. That's just a stamped sheet metal buttstock. Inside there, we have a recoil buffer. You can rotate that. You push this in, rotate it 90 degrees. That comes out. So this is to reduce the final impact of the bolt after it opens all the way. One of the interesting things about the FG42 is it is really built right up to the design. Like there's not a huge safety factor in the design of the FG42, and there couldn't be, just to keep it short and lightweight. All right, so take that out. Next, we can take out the bolt and operating rod. Just pop that back. We can pull this back to here. The recoil spring comes out. That is captive. And then we can lift the charging handle out. So when this is in place, the front of the recoil spring actually locks into the charging handle, prevents it from flying out of the gun, which would be bad. We then have our bolt and bolt carrier / operating rod. Next up, I can push this collar in, rotate it a little bit, and pull out the spring there. And then this slides off. So the firing pin is held by the bolt carrier itself, and it's fixed in place. The bolt is going to slide over it like this. We have this rotating cam surface that causes the bolt to lock. And then once locked, the bolt sort of sits in this position with a bunch of free travel ahead of it, with this spring compressed in the back. When you pull the trigger, what's going to happen is the whole gas piston jumps forward this slight bit, and that is what actually fires the gun. Now, there are locking notches, sear notches, down here, so it can be fired from either the open or closed bolt position. And the way this is set up is it fires semi-automatic from the closed bolt, full auto from the open bolt. The next step in disassembly would be to take off the pistol grip. with the fire control assembly. And that is done by taking this flat spring and it pivots down this way, which allows you to remove this front pin, and then it lifts forward out of that pin. So this is a retainer that holds these two pins in place, and then the grip assembly comes off. Unfortunately, this one doesn't want to come out easily, and because this gun is worth like as much as my house, I don't want to force it. So I'm going to leave that one on there. We'll see if we can get the pistol grip off of the second pattern and show you the inside there. But other than that, this is essentially completely, well, this is in fact field stripped. So you can see the complexity of this receiver, the broaching operations in order to machine out the interior here are crazy. These were not assembled, these were not manufactured in halves and welded together or anything. They were machined as complete receivers. And yeah, the complexity there is just really pretty staggering. So we got a pin there that locks the barrel in place. If we go to the front of the rifle, we can take off the front sight assembly there. That just slides off. It's retained by the muzzle brake. We can then unscrew this retainer. And from this point, if it weren't carboned up, we could unscrew the front of the gas block and pull the whole bipod and gas block assembly off. But again, because this gun is worth more than my house, we're going to leave it at this stage. So let's move on to the second pattern. Despite the parts not being interchangeable, the process here is essentially identical. We have a button in the stock. It's in a slightly different position, but we push that in and it allows us to pull off the wooden stock. Note that the original, of course, had a metal butt plate. This has a wooden butt plate, and it is held in place by two cross pins here. And you can see this one has cracked right there. That was very common. Like one of the failings of the second pattern FGs is that the wood back here was too weak and it cracked at the butt plates. Now we have our buffer once again, so we can push this in, rotate it, pull it out. We have a recoil spring. Note that this one is not contained the way the first pattern is. And we can then cock the action, bring this back to this point. Charging handle comes out. We can then pull out the bolt and carrier assembly. This one's got a bunch of grease on it. You'll note that there is not an open slot back here, but again, the disassembly method is the same. We push this in, rotate it 90 degrees, it comes out. We can then pull out the firing pin, essentially firing pin spring, the bolt spring. Now, on the first pattern, we could lift the bolt off and the firing pin remained intact on the op rod. On the second pattern, we cannot. So you rotate the bolt to there and wiggle it off, and the firing pin comes out inside the bolt. So there's our second model firing pin. And bolt carrier, op rod, gas piston, whatever you want to call it. Front end disassembly would be the same here. You take this muzzle nut off, front sight slides off. You can then unscrew this retainer and then the whole gas block. Well, and then take out the plug here and the whole gas block slides off. So I apologize that I can't completely do this, but what we do have these far enough apart to see a couple big differences between the internal components. So here are the parts from both guns, the first pattern and the second pattern. The bolts show some major differences. You can see they both have the same sort of cam track, but the first pattern is open all the way to the back. Second pattern is not. The bolt is larger in diameter for the second pattern over here. The first pattern has an ejector, a sliding ejector built into the bolt itself. The second pattern has an ejector that's built into the receiver of the gun. Charging handles, you can see a substantial difference in, obviously in the shape, but also in the complexity of the machining. This first pattern is a lot more operations to make than this second pattern. The second pattern is frankly more comfortable to use. On the recoil buffers, you can see that the first pattern has these much smaller interrupted threads. The second pattern goes for just two really big chunky ones right there. The front ends are slightly different as well. Like every little details changed on all of these parts, which is fascinating to see. On our bolt carriers, again, the mechanical principle remains the same, but all of the details of the small parts change. And you can see that the gas piston on the second pattern is larger in diameter than the first pattern. So first, second. Second pattern is larger in diameter. And then, of course, captive springs. This is something that, frankly, I think makes the guns much more convenient to disassemble and work on. The first pattern had captive springs for both. The second pattern has captive springs for neither, but they did go to multi-strand braided springs, which is a good plan. Had development of this gone further, I would think that eventually, like a theoretical post-war version of the FG42 would have had a lot of the second pattern features, but like it would have had the braided spring, but it would have had self-contained springs. So there you go. There's something you are not going to see very often. The internals of both a first and second pattern FG42. It's a very cool opportunity to have both of these guns available in one place at the same time. Like I said, I hadn't actually compared them before. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.